Autumn 1944, a farm lane on the western approaches to Aachen, the first German city standing in the path of the American First Army. Behind the fieldstone wall of a cattle barn, a crew of German tank hunters has spent the better part of the morning preparing to fire exactly once. They are good at this, and they have done it on 3 fronts. They have backed their 75mm gun deep into the barn so the muzzle sits a meter inside the doorway where no flash will show on the lane. They have knocked a firing slit through the fieldstone and packed the rubble back around it until the whole looks like part of the ruin. They have cut the brush in front of the barn so the gun has a clean lane down the track, and nothing else does. The gun stands only a little over a meter tall at the shield. From 40 meters off, in the flat gray autumn light, the farm is just a broken barn on dead ground, the kind of thing an advancing army passes 100 times a day without a second look. A little after noon, a Sherman noses around the bend. The gun fires 1 round. The shell goes in below the turret. The tank stops and begins to pour smoke, and 2 of the 5 men inside climb out of the top of it, and 3 of them do not. Now, the crew does the one thing their entire profession demands of them next. They make ready to hook the gun to its tractor and disappear before anyone on the American side can work out where the shot came from. That is the whole craft of the tank hunter. Hit once, then vanish. They do not get the chance. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. There is no aircraft overhead, no spotter plane droning in slow circles, nothing in the sky at all. And in the time it takes the gun commander to shout his first order, the lane and the barnyard come apart at once. Not 1 bomb, a dozen guns, firing from positions miles to the rear, none of them able to see the farm, put their shells into the same few square meters of dirt inside the same 3 seconds. The wall the crew had trusted is simply not there anymore. The handful who lived through it crawl out and cannot tell anyone what found them. There was nothing to look at and nothing to shoot back at. The shot they fired was supposed to be invisible, and the answer came through a solid stone wall, as if the wall had never been built. Versions of this happened all autumn and winter across the American front, and the men it happened to could not account for it. To understand what was reaching them through the wall, we have to begin with why they were so certain that nothing could. The weapon behind that wall was almost certainly a 7.5 centimeter Pak 40, and to understand the crew's confidence, you have to respect the gun. Rheinmetall built more than 23,000 of them, and from 1942 to the end of the war, it was the standard German anti-tank gun. It was the backbone of the Panzerjäger, the German anti-tank branch, and Panzerjäger means word for word, tank hunter. A crew of 6 could put 14 rounds a minute down range. The gun could punch through the front plate of an American Sherman at any range a gunner would ever sensibly take the shot, and it stood only about 1.20 meters at the top of its shield, which mattered more than any of the other numbers, because a gun that low is a gun you can hide in a ditch, a hedge bank, a shell hole, or the dark of a doorway, and then you wait. The waiting was the doctrine. The Pak 40 was a defensive weapon and was never meant to lead an attack. You sat it on the lane a tank would have to use, sloped and camouflaged the shield, draped the barrel in cut branches or rubble, and held your fire until the target was inside your killing range and could not get out of it. The first sign that a position existed at all was usually a tank with a hole in it. The crews chose corners of stone barns, gaps in the hedges, the shadow of a wall. In a town, the same idea simply moved indoors. You back the gun, or a track tank destroyer, into the ground floor of a house and fired through a loophole, with a foot of old German masonry between you and the street. The ground was on the German side too. In Normandy, it was the bocage, the ancient earth and vegetation walls that boxed in every field from every other field, terrain so good for the defender that the British theorist JFC Fuller called it some of the most defensible country a modern army had ever met. Every hedgerow corner was a possible position, and every junction an interlocking field of fire. On the German border, the country changed to stone villages and the towns of the West Wall, built of the kind of thick masonry that shrugged off a rifle and laughed at a grenade. The tank hunter knew his gun, he knew his doctrine, and he knew his ground. Through June and into July, the knowledge paid in full. American armored battalions crossed open fields and lost their lead tanks in heaps to guns they never saw, and whole companies were gutted in single afternoons. By the time the campaign moved off the beaches, the German anti-tank service had every reason to believe its craft still worked. Then the guns started getting found, not once in a while by bad luck, steadily, found with no aircraft in the sky, found at night, found behind walls. The crews reached for explanations, the way men do when the world stops making sense, and their explanations were wrong in interesting ways. Some were sure the Americans had secret listening machines. Some were sure French civilians were signaling their positions from the ground. A few decided there were traitors inside their own lines. The real thing that was finding them sat a couple of miles back, and it was one of the quietest secrets of the war. The answer was not a gadget bolted to a tank. It was a method, run by an unglamorous corps of men almost nobody has heard of, and it was built on one stubborn fact about the world. A stone wall stops light. It does not stop sound. When a gun fires, muzzle blast throws out a low, heavy pressure wave, a deep, rolling rumble far below the sharp crack you hear when you stand next to it. That wave does not care about the wall. It rolls over the barn, around the corner of the house, out across the field, and keeps going. The same whether the wall is there or not. The thing that hid the gun from every pair of eyes on the battlefield did nothing whatsoever to the boom of its own firing, and the Americans had learned to listen. The work was called sound ranging, and its partner was called flash spotting, and both lived inside units with one of the dullest names in the Army, the Field Artillery Observation Battalions. They were a corps asset, reporting to the Corps Artillery Commander, and their entire job was to find the enemy's guns. A sound base was a line of microphones, usually 6 of them, strung out across something like 7,000 yards, and still a couple of thousand yards behind the front. Every single position fixed by survey to within inches. The microphone itself traced back to a low-frequency design invented in the First World War by a British corporal named Tucker, tuned to catch the heavy rumble of a gun and throw away the rest of the noise. When a German gun fired, that pressure wave reached each microphone a fraction of a second apart. A recorder caught those split-second differences and laid them out like the wiggles a seismograph makes for an earthquake. Men at a plotting board turned the time differences into curves drawn on a map, and the curves crossed on the gun. When friendly artillery was firing and drowning the microphones in noise, the flash spotters took over. Observers on surveyed posts took bearings on the muzzle flash itself and crossed the lines the same way the sound men crossed theirs. 2 methods, each one covering for the other's weakness. Honesty requires a footnote here, because the system was tuned for artillery, whose deep report carries best, and a single anti-tank gun firing one small round was a harder thing to catch than a battery of howitzers. In practice, the tank hunter was run down by a layered net rather than one clever box. The sound men and the flash men, the forward observers watching the lanes, the slow spotter planes from the companion arm overhead, and the simple fact that a gun in a long fight rarely fires only once, all of it stacked together until the position was no longer a mystery. The men who tied the whole thing together were a strange and specific breed. The survey officers in these battalions were, in large part, officers of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, the peacetime map makers and chart makers detailed into the Army for the duration of the war. More than half of that service's commissioned officers went into uniform. A couple of dozen of them ended up in the field artillery, most as the survey brains of the observation battalions, and one of them built the survey school at Fort Sill that trained hundreds more. The performance was the part that broke the German crews. A seasoned section could pass a gun's location to the corps intelligence officer in 3 to 5 minutes. Sound ranging could place a gun to within a few tens of meters, and by late in the war, the refinements were good enough to estimate the caliber of the gun and the direction it was pointing. All of it built from the sound of a single shot the crew believed no one on Earth could trace, and it was secret. The work was kept tightly classified, and the men referred to their own unit only by its initials. It was so far below the surface that when General Ben Lear inspected one of these battalions during training and was told it belonged to his own command, his entire answer was, "Never heard of them." If a 3-star American general had never heard of the thing, the crew behind the German wall had no chance at all of working it out. If the men in this part of the story mean anything to you, the sound rangers, and the flash spotters, and the surveyors who crawled out to string wire under shell fire so the guns behind them could see, take 1 second and hit the like button. They were the ears of the army, and they are about the least remembered men of the entire campaign. Keeping them visible costs you nothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Finding a gun is only half of the problem. The other half is killing it before the crew can limber up and run. And here the Americans had spent the whole of the 1930s building something the rest of the world had not. At Fort Sill, they had worked out the fire direction center, the arrangement that let a single radio call gather the fire of many separate battalions onto one point on the map. None of that worked without the survey. To mass fire from guns scattered across miles of countryside, you have to know 3 things at once. You have to know exactly where your own guns are. You have to know exactly where the target is. And you have to know the precise bearing from one to the other. Supplying all 3 was the surveyor's job, and it is why the same coast and geodetic survey men who located the German guns also spent their nights tying every battery and every observation post in the Corps to one common grid. The whole point of that labor, in the period's own blunt phrase, was putting iron on target. Without it, the trick the Germans hated most could not exist. That trick was time on target. Each battery computed the flight time of its own shells and then fired in a carefully staggered order so that every round, from guns spread across the landscape, fell in the same instant, within about 3 seconds of one another. The reason was cold and exact. Most of the casualties from a bombardment happen in the first few seconds, before the men on the receiving end can throw themselves down and get under cover. So the Americans arranged for the entire weight to land at once, with no ranging rounds to give a warning. General J. Lawton Collins had been one of the first to push fire direction centers and mass time on target shoots on Guadalcanal, and he carried the method into 7th Corps for Normandy and the breakout in Operation Cobra. Now put the 2 halves together from the German side. The tank hunter fires 1 shot. Within a few minutes, his position is fixed by the sound of that shot. The Corps Fire Direction Center hands the coordinate to a dozen battalions, already tied to the same grid. The steel arrives all together. From inside the experience, it was 1 shot and then the end of the world. From the American side, that 1 shot had told them everything they needed. It was not theoretical. On one documented occasion, a German battery was located by the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The coordinate passed back to the heavy guns, and a single concentration killed a visiting German inspection team and most of the gun crews within minutes of the shells coming down. The Germans had walked out to a position to watch a demonstration, and the demonstration was their own annihilation. At Cassino earlier in the war, an American corps had deliberately held its counter-battery fire for days, so the observation battalion could quietly fix the position of every German. Gun first, saying nothing, giving nothing away. Then, on the night of the attack, they drowned all of them at once, and the infantry went forward with the German artillery silent. The discipline of waiting, of locating everything before firing anything, was itself a weapon. In the barnyard, the wall was a figure of speech, the gun's armor made of stone. In the cities, it became literal stone. And there, the German tank hunter met a second answer, this one delivered by American armor itself. The hardest case was Aachen. fought through October 1944. The Army's own study of tanks in city fighting describes a battle measured not in miles, but in buildings, floors, and rooms. German tank hunter teams had a weapon made for exactly this kind of work: the Panzerfaust, a cheap, single-shot throwaway launcher that one frightened teenager could fire from a cellar window and gut a Sherman with. Panzerfaust knocked out American tanks in the streets, and some of the heavy old German buildings turned out to be flatly impervious to ordinary tank fire. A gun behind 2 feet of 19th century stone was a problem a tank's standard round could not always solve. The American answer was combined arms worked out at the lowest tactical level, and a willingness to apply an absurd amount of direct fire to a single house. When a building would not give, Lieutenant Colonel John Corley of the 26th Infantry Regiment brought up a self-propelled 155mm gun and used it in the street like an enormous tank. It practically leveled a sturdy building with one shot. Tankers learned reconnaissance by fire, putting a round into a suspicious window or doorway and reading what answered back. The wall that had been the tank hunter's whole reason for confidence stopped being protection the moment the Americans decided to shoot through it, rather than maneuver around it. In the town, the man behind the wall faced both halves of the problem at once. There was the network that could find him by the sound of his own single shot, reaching back to a microphone line he could not see. And there was the armor in front of him that could come straight through the brick to get him. There was nowhere in that arithmetic for him to stand. Aachen surrendered on the 21st of October, the first German city to fall to the Western Allies. If your father or grandfather served in an armored division, a tank destroyer battalion, a field artillery battalion, one of the observation battalions in the long push across France and into Germany, I would be honored to read about him in the comments. What was the unit and what did he actually do? The details that never reach the official histories are usually the ones that matter most. The obvious question is why the Germans could not simply build the same machine, and the answer comes in 2 halves. Only one of them is the half everyone already knows. The half everyone knows is the air. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was finished over the Western Front, short of fuel and short of pilots, so the German tank hunter had no eyes of his own in the sky, and no way to keep the American eyes out. That is true, and it is most of the story people usually tell. The other half is harder, and it is the part that lived on the ground. The pieces of the ground answer were not secret in principle. Sound ranging had been invented in the First World War, and German officers had worked on the idea themselves. The Germans had surveyors. They had good artillery and good radios. What they never had was the fusion. They never built a corps-wide net that tied every gun and every microphone and every observation post to one grid, fed one fire direction center, and let a single coordinate pull the fire of a dozen battalions onto one point in minutes. Part of that failure was technical. Building the net required years of pre-war survey work, standardized equipment across every unit in a theater, and communication infrastructure that could survive the kind of sustained aerial bombardment the Allies had been delivering since 1943. The Germans were attempting to hold a front that was being pushed backward by ground pressure and torn apart from above simultaneously. You cannot wire a continent under those conditions, and you cannot train the specialists to run the system while your training schools are being bombed. But the deeper problem was institutional, and this is the part that receives almost no attention in the standard accounts. The American artillery system handed genuine authority to quiet technical men. A sound-ranging officer at corps level could request fire from battalions he did not command, and the request would be honored, because the system had been built to treat his data as actionable. A fire direction center sergeant could work a plotting board and translate raw numbers into a fire mission without waiting for an officer to confirm each step. Fort Sill had spent years training exactly this kind of specialist, and the Army had spent years learning to trust him. That cut directly against the grain of how the German Army was being run by late 1944. Centralized authority, enforced from a headquarters in East Prussia, made the kind of lateral coordination the American net depended on nearly impossible at the unit level. A German artillery commander who wanted to mass fires across multiple corps boundaries faced a command structure that had not been designed for that conversation and a political environment in which requesting resources from a neighboring formation could be read as an admission of weakness. The Americans had built a machine. The Germans had talented gunners inside a structure that could not connect them to each other, and the thing worked in near silence. A senior American artillery commander felt compelled to write a letter to his own corps in October 1944 to tell his soldiers something they apparently had not grasped. The Germans, he wrote, even the best and most experienced of them, were visibly frightened of the Americans, and no branch of the ground forces had punished the German army harder than the artillery. The men being punished could feel every ounce of it. They could see none of it. That is the whole answer to the question we started with. The crew, behind the wall, saw a shell. They did not see the line of microphones 2 miles back that heard their single shot. They did not see the Coast and Geodetic Survey officer who had stitched the entire corps onto one grid in the dark. They did not see the fire direction center, gathering a dozen batteries onto the coordinate their own muzzle had just handed it. In the cold open, they saw a tank, and in the city, they saw a tank again, and the tank was only the front edge of the thing. Their individual weapons were often the better weapons. The PaK-40 outranged American tank guns. The Panther and the Tiger outclassed the Sherman. The wall was real, solid German stone. None of it decided anything, because the Americans were not fighting weapon against weapon, fighting a network against a gun. The network could find the gun through the wall, and it could gather its fire faster than the gun could move, and a gun that cannot move after it fires is already a dead gun. The men who built that network came home and mostly never spoke of it, because most of them had spent the war doing careful arithmetic on a map board, in the dark. One of them was David Whipp, a Coast and Geodetic Survey officer who served more than 900 days in the line as a corps surveyor across North Africa, Italy, and France. The thing he was proudest of, at the very end of all of it, was that not one man of his unit was ever captured by the Germans. He wrote home once about stepping outside the survey center near midnight and seeing a convoy roll past with its headlights on out in the open, where headlights meant a man's death the day before. Slowly he understood that this could only mean the Germans had surrendered. He sat down by himself in the middle of a field and watched the first lights he had seen in years. The sound rangers and the flash spotters and the surveyors were among the least visible men in the whole war. A 3-star general who owned one of their battalions had never heard of it. They found the guns that everyone else swore were invisible, and they did it from the sound of a single shot fired through a stone wall. And they deserved to be remembered as names rather than as a footnote underneath the artillery. If this story gave you something to think about, hit the like button, because it helps this channel reach people who care about how wars are actually won rather than the versions that fit neatly on a poster. And subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there is more to tell about the unseen men who learned, slowly and at terrible cost, how to find an enemy who was completely certain he could not be found.